Nicola Yiannoulis, Senior Policy Expert στην Ευρωπαϊκή Αρχή Τραπεζών, το European Banking Authority. Dr. Ruth Wandhöfer, Partner στην Gauss Ventures. Shruti Ajitsaria, Partner και επικεφαλής της Fuse Allen and Overy. Και Anastasia Dokuchaeva, Head of Product στην Klausmatch. Τη συζήτηση θα διευθύνει και κατευθύνει η Sophia Bantanidis, επικεφαλής Regulatory Strategy and Policy Treasury and Trade Solutions Innovation στη Citi. Good afternoon, ladies. It's wonderful having with you all here among us today. We're eager, to be honest, to listen to your discussion. Also, Sophia, it's great seeing you again, even though it's not in person, but digitally.
Thank you. Thank you, Panagiotis. I hope you can all see me and hear me. Delighted to be here today. Good. That's great. And thank you, Panagiotis, to you and your team, the whole team at Boussias, for organizing Greece's first conference on RegTech. So welcome to our RegTech panel. I'm just going to say a few words about the topic du jour before we go on to the panel Q&A discussion. So the RegTech ecosystem, it's been around for many years, and it aims to help firms like ourselves, like Citibank, close the gap between compliance and efficiency using technology. So that's one side of the coin, and we're going to explore that on the panel and the value it can add. But the other side of the coin is the use of supervisory and regulatory technology by authorities and by supervisors, the subtech or souptech bit, as it's been coined. And again, we will explore that today as well. And I think, looking back at the global financial services crisis with the huge tsunami of regulatory change that came with it at the time, combined with the substantial increase in the availability of data that we have today and the granularity of data, and overlaid with new infrastructures such as APIs, it really created this perfect storm for RegTech and SupTech ecosystem to flourish. And as a result of these technologies, we can now more efficiently collect, analyze, get insights on data, and make decisions from large data sets. Now, I've been fortunate enough to witness the benefits of RegTech and the problems that it helps to address from both sides of the fence. I used to be a regulator. I used to work for the FCA. And at the time, I was my first job there was working in financial promotions, and my team was responsible for assessing financial promotions to see if they comply with rules and regulations. That was a really manual, paper-based task that took forever, and it wasn't that exciting. Now, fast forward to today, and the team now uses technology such as web scraping and text mining to automatically audit promotional material disseminated by financial institutions. So a much more efficient and effective way of doing the same task. Fast forward a few years, and I was, before Citibank, I worked at Northern Trust, where I was in charge of regulatory developments from a compliance and risk perspective, but also, and more interestingly, from turning regulatory developments into commercial opportunities, into product opportunities. And one of the key things that we needed at the time was like early warning signals on emerging regulation as it happened globally, the key points from these developments, so that my team could focus on the hard work, the detailed impact assessments, advising the business, and really working hand in glove with them to create products on the back of regulatory change. Now, if only at the time we had the technology and we had the providers, the RegTech providers that we have today to help save us time in keeping up to date with the very fast changing regulatory environment. The recent events over the last year with the COVID-19 health crisis, I think, has brought RegTech to center stage. And some commentators would say the industry is at a key inflection point in its development. We have seen more interest in RegTech to help meet some of the consequences on the back of COVID. I'll give you just some examples. We have seen numerous digital KYC solutions for remote customer onboarding come to the market on the back of the different social distancing measures that countries put in place. Also in March last year, when many countries were going into lockdown, we saw a lot of excitement from regulators. We saw multiple regulatory developments be disseminated on the back of COVID. I think in 1 month alone, there were 1,300 pieces of regulatory change. And certainly technology has a role to play to help us keep abreast of these changes and to help us implement them. So on the panel today, we're going to explore the value of RegTech for banks, for our banks' clients, and for regulators. We're going to look at what are some of the challenges that are out there for the industry. How can those challenges be overcome? Where's the smart money going in RegTech? Where are people investing? What are some of the hot areas? And how will it evolve in the future? And I'm joined today by my panel of experts, which Panagiotis has already introduced. So let's move on straight to the panel discussion. And I'm going to turn to Ruth first. Ruth, I think you're best placed with your vast experience to tell us a little bit about how the regulatory challenge for firms is evolving, and how are you seeing different firms respond to this challenge?
Thank you very much, Sophia, and good morning, everybody. Great that you can join us here online. So let me talk a little bit about the regulatory challenge. So as Sophia pointed out, I mean, complexity of regulation continues to increase. It is disheartening to a certain extent to hear that 1,300 new pieces of reg change came even in 1 month of COVID. I guess on the counter flip side to that, we've seen that regulators at a global stage have actually given the industry in the financial services space a little bit relief when it comes to some of the Basel-related and risk-related measures. There were a few deadlines postponed throughout the last year and a half because banks felt quite challenged with the COVID challenge itself. So whilst there has been some postponing, it doesn't mean that regulation goes away at all. We see regulation continue to evolve, whether it's from a balance sheet management, capital, liquidity, and risk perspective around the Basel Accords, including operational risk, which is coming increasingly to the fore, and is something that really requires firms to have a good grip around all their operational processes. Anti-money laundering, KYC, is a key area. Fraud is a key area that continues to be a big focus. And we do see this now also spilling over into the emerging and continuously growing cryptocurrency space, digital asset space. So we see an extension of the financial services value chain. And with this, we see an ongoing extension of the regulatory measures that accompany it. When I look at how firms are responding, I very much concur with you, Sophia, that we finally start seeing banks adopt RegTech. It is still hesitant, but it is certainly happening in areas where we have seen too much manual intervention and therefore too many operational risks of getting things wrong. If I just think about compliance processes on AML, on KYC, on identification of customers, these tended to be huge heaps of paper that are reviewed once in a year. But these papers actually have to be automated into a process. And we see a number of very interesting RegTechs that provide this automation, which means you have an internal automated process flow with bells and whistles, which really tries to minimize manual intervention, only requires compliance colleagues to look over documentation if there's a real uncertainty. So automation of process in terms of compliance procedures is absolutely key. It doesn't sound too exciting, but my goodness, it really does cut the cost on FTE, which is really, really important. The other area, AML, KYC transaction screening, if you think about the payment space, is something where we've seen lots of positive developments and adoption, and it gets really more and more automated. We had a number of old school technology firms providing these services, but now we have a really good set of fintechs that is a lot more agile in that space. We also have ID verification, which is a key area that we've seen in terms of the adoption. Something, for example, in the online space, as you open your accounts with a neobank, ID verification with different methods is becoming very common now, using biometrics. The same goes for authentication methods to authenticate a transaction or a customer. And if I think about the sort of broader spectrum, I think one area where the industry has been a little bit lagging behind, and it is very clear that even these areas are still in its infancy of development, because developing RegTech at scale is something that takes a while. It takes a cultural shift. It takes stakeholder engagement. But I think an area to call out that I think is very important and should be adopted further is sort of the broader AI view around risk management and risk analytics, risk modeling using synthetic data sets with agent-based risk modeling, which can give you a real interesting insight on fraud trends. It can give you even insights on how you model the risks from a pandemic, from a government perspective, from a regulator perspective. And I think that is an area that does require, on the bank side or on any user side, a fairly sophisticated set of people that are quite experienced in the space of data analytics and data coding. And therefore, you are starting to see that talent has to continue to develop within regulators, within banks, in order to actually use those more sophisticated services. Of course, with COVID, as we'll discuss later, data has a new challenge to it on its own right. And data privacy regulation is another area that requires quite a lot of RegTech in terms of making sure that your data stays safe and isn't shared with the wrong entities. I leave it at that for a start. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. That was extremely comprehensive, and we'll unpick some of those points you made later on in the panel. I'd like to move to Anastasia now. Anastasia, you're head of product at ClauseMatch, and you are the RegTech provider on this panel. And I'm just conscious, I'm sure the audience with us today, they might not be intimately familiar with ClauseMatch. And could you tell us a little bit about what led to ClauseMatch's creation? Why did the founders even create ClauseMatch? What are the pain points that they saw? Because I understand they used to work for a large bank. What were the pain points they saw, and what is ClauseMatch solving for banks like ourselves, for example?
Hi, Sophia. Thank you so much for having me. And Ruth has actually brought in a wonderful segue to answering this question. ClauseMatch is at the heart a document management, content management platform. Our solution was built or brought up from the point of pain that we saw across organizations trying to manage large volume of documents describing the ways of doing business and processes, be it financial crime, AML policies, operational risk policies, and it all lives in documentation in static format. And because of that, it's really, really difficult to keep them up to date and reflect the true representation of the way business does its business. So we saw lots of manual processes of keeping those documents up to date, and we're talking about thousands and tens of thousands of documents when we talk about policies and procedures. If we start talking about legal contracts and some further documentation, client-facing documentation, we're talking about large volumes of high-risk content that needs to be updated. What organizations are also struggling to do is evidence that the regulatory change and the regulatory obligations impacting them as a business are reflected, and there is a way to demonstrate compliance to those regulatory requirements as part of the broader understanding of what systems and processes are in place. And really the biggest challenge that we hear in financial services and in any other heavily regulated industry is the ability or need to map regulations to policies, to procedures, to processes, to people, to internal controls, and see a straight through line of how organization complies with the requirements. This is the backbone of the solution that we're trying to build and what we are trying to help organizations do efficiently, cost and time wise.
Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. And Shruti, I'd like to bring you in at this point because I understand you were an early stage investor in ClauseMatch. So really the perfect time to ask you what attracted you to them? What did you find exciting about their solution?
Yeah, so I think I must have probably been one of the first people to ever see ClauseMatch in action. And at the time, I was a derivatives lawyer at Overy, and I had worked on the Lehman bankruptcy, doing the job of looking in paper files, like genuinely, I say this and people I don't think really believe it, but looking for paper files and pulling through lots of documents and looking for ISDA master agreements and looking for notice provisions and then looking at what we had on the system and seeing if it compared correctly to the Word document that I had printed off and could see in my hands was signed, and then sending out all of the notices. And I remember one day the founder of ClauseMatch came to my house as I do my angel investments on a Sunday night over a pizza and a glass of wine, came to my house for a pizza and a glass of wine and said, oh, well, look, if the whole of Lehman had done all of their ISDA master agreements on here, then when Lehman Brothers went bust, you could have pressed a button and it would have told you every single ISDA master agreement that it had entered into, and it would have told you what the notice provisions were for those ISDA master agreements, and it would have told you what the governing law was of those ISDA master agreements. And I thought of all the hours of work that I had put in and the number of days that I'd been up until 2 o'clock in the morning looking for pieces of paper, and I realised that it was just a much better way. So I invested in the company just because I really felt like it would revolutionise the way that law was done. But it also inspired me to start Fuse, which is Alan Overy's tech incubator, because it made me realise that there were a lot of solutions similar to Clause Match out there that weren't actually making their way into the hands of the lawyers.
Thank you, Shruti. And let's continue a little bit with the theme of the Fuse Accelerator. I mean, I'm sure there are loads of legal tech, RegTech, deal tech firms that have been through your accelerator. And I guess I'd like to hear from you, what solutions are you seeing that are getting more traction with the end client when they graduate from the accelerator? And where are those solutions adding value for the client?
So to my mind, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, but to my mind, there is still quite a lot of low-hanging fruit that is available for RegTech companies to tackle. So Ruth, you talked about AML and KYC, and to me, that is kind of like the lowest of hanging fruit. You know, it's extraordinary that we weren't doing that using a more efficient process, you know, just as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. But there's still quite a lot of low-hanging fruit. And Anastasia, the point you've just made, which is kind of connecting up regulations to policies and knowing what the kind of straight-through line looks like, that to me falls actually within the category of low-hanging fruit, because you should easily be able to say, well, this regulation has changed. What impact does that have on what I, as an institution, am required to do? That doesn't seem to me to be overly difficult, actually. And so in terms of what we're seeing, which is successful, we're seeing companies with easy to understand solutions. So anything which is too complex is too difficult. It sometimes requires like a group of stakeholders who really understand the value. So you can have a really good solution, but if you're not talking to the right people within the right institution, and they can't see the value and really articulate why somebody should spend money on it, it's really difficult, I think, for you to get traction within the institution. Connectivity. So one thing that we're definitely seeing at Alan Overy, and I suspect is problematic, you know, in multiple fashion in the banks, is that we'll buy a little solution for this and a little solution for this and this little solution for that, and all of a sudden you're expecting a lawyer to have 27 different logins and 27 different trainings, and you've kind of replaced one problem with another. So connectivity and ease of use, I think, is really important. And the user experience, actually, I think is very important in general. Just, you know, no one wants a tech solution that they can't understand. And we've seen a plethora of no-code solutions that aren't really no-code solutions, and they require 3 days of training before you can use a no-code solution. Nobody wants that, so they have to be easy to use and do what they say on the tin. And I think they need to, the company itself needs to be business ready, by which I mean it needs to understand what information security requirements it is going to need to meet. It needs to understand what procurement contract is going to look like, and it needs to understand that it perhaps has to have a 24-hour service desk. And so often we'll see a really good product and we'll get to kind of like the license piece, and they'll say, oh, well, you know, what happens if someone has a problem on a deal at 2 o'clock in the morning? They're like, oh, they can call my mobile. Like, no. So I think business readiness is really important.
Yes, thank you. And those points resonate really well, certainly from my perspective. I also sit on the Citi Accelerator and the Accenture Accelerator. And those are some of the common themes that we see as well when we mentor RegTech firms, particularly the business readiness point, which one would think is really obvious, but you would be surprised at how many firms are out there that are actually not business ready. So thank you for that. And at this stage, I'd like to bring in Nicola to the conversation. Nicola, you represent our regulator, the European Banking Authority. And I guess I've got 2 questions for you. First of all, maybe from a regulator's perspective, could you tell us, how do you dimension RegTech? When you guys think about RegTech, what do you think about? Are you thinking only about firms like Clause Match, for example? Or do you think about the sort of legacy solutions that a lot of big banks like ourselves adopt? So that's part one. How do you dimension and frame and think about RegTech? And I suppose part two is why are regulators interested in RegTech? Why is the EBA interested in RegTech, in the RegTech ecosystem?
Thanks, Sophia. So, good morning to everybody, or good afternoon. So we define RegTech, and just forgive me for reading out the definition, but we define RegTech as any range of applications of tech-enabled innovation for regulatory compliance and reporting requirements implemented by a regulated institution. And that could be with or without the assistance of third-party providers. Essentially, we're thinking about how those regulated institutions are using technology to better comply with regulations. So it's not limited to startups only. We're just looking more at the innovation and how it's used and what the purpose is. And for us, I mean, in terms of why we're interested in it, I could give you sort of three main reasons. So, from a regulatory perspective, we want to support the scaling up of innovation more generally. So the digitalization in the finance sector is something key that we want to make sure that we can facilitate. So we need to have that understanding. Secondly, we want to make sure that the regulatory and supervisory framework is not only there to facilitate, but that it addresses any risks that may arise as well. And then thirdly, from a sort of more inward-looking perspective, we want to make sure that the regulators and supervisors can adapt to those new technologies, that we understand them. I think that's something that's been mentioned a few times today, that we can promote their usage only by having that understanding, and then even in due course to be able to reciprocate from a sub-tech perspective as well.
Thank you, Nicola. And let's continue with this sub-tech theme. And Anastasia, I'd like to turn to you because I know you've worked with various regulators, and maybe could you tell us a little bit more about how are you seeing regulators adopt RegTech, and also what impact do you think this will have on regulated firms? If we have all these regulators using this really cool technology, what's the impact going to be on firms?
Sure, that's a great question, and we have had a pleasure of working with a number of regulators globally over the years, and it's exciting and inspiring to see some of the initiatives. To highlight some of the ones that really stand out right now, and generally there are quite a few significant improvements and advancements they're making. So, for example, there is a lot of drive to start authoring, drafting, and publishing regulation in digital machine-readable format. That presents a number of opportunities and impacts regulated firms quite significantly. For example, you could argue that with the availability of digital handbooks and accessibility to it via public API is an ability to intake perhaps a regulation into the business quicker, make an assessment of the impact it has in a much more programmatic, automated way, and therefore enhance the implementation of that regulation. So cost savings, efficiency, and automation are the benefits to the regulated firms. Another one is more towards, if you have a digital copy of a rule book, can it be used to create guided and more assisted experience for organizations applying for licensing in jurisdictions and working and trying to work with regulators. Another initiatives I see is around cross-referencing regulatory framework locally against a broader global initiatives and intentions. Obviously, there is lots of different rule books and regulations, but making them consistent or making them balanced so that organizations expanding into other jurisdictions are more capable of launching their businesses in those regions quicker. A lot of that is quite interesting. And just to give an example of that, we see quite a lot of financial crime, obviously KYC, AML, and so forth have been a big area of topic, but there is lots of emphasis on ESG right now, and ESG isn't a one country problem. ESG is everyone, and everyone needs to get involved, including RegTechs ourselves. So I constantly look at things, what can I do from close-match perspective? on the ESG space? And can I make our product more accessible for people with disability? Can I design my product in a more sustainable design way that it doesn't take the carbon oxide just by opening up a page and so forth? So there's a lot of little things, but really, really important that all of us come together and are part of the solution. So I think that makes a difference. Another one that was actually quite kind of mentioned briefly earlier is all about supervisory and regulatory reporting. Nobody wants another black swan event, right? And how do we enable technology to drive what a regulated firm blueprint should look like, and look at assessing the reality of the regulated firm and identifying weaker spots or areas of greater exposure so that we can prevent those unintended consequences. And obviously, Basel is an interesting, Basel is a great way of addressing it, and the liquidity and risk scoring that it drives. And big data analytics, right? Being able to do big data analytics, to look at the outliers, to look at the exposures, and most importantly, to do it in real time. We can't wait until month end or year end to see what happened in the past. We need to be reactive and drive what's going to happen in the future. And last but not least, just to kind of finish on that topic, besides just having those types of RegTechs and technologies that are available and are growing, I also wanted to highlight some of the initiatives that regulators are doing in terms of open banking, as an example, in the UK, but also seeing some of the sandboxes that are driven out of the regulators that provide a safe harbor to test new ideas, to launch new products, to really generate some new opportunities across the business. So it's worth highlighting that it's a technology adoption and a drive that the regulators do on that front as well.
Yeah, thank you, Anastasia. That was extremely comprehensive, and we will come back to the point about the regulatory sandboxes and your experience in them and how that can help sort of move the industry along. But switching gears a little bit, I'd like to talk about investments in RegTech. Ruth, you're an investor. Tell us a little bit about sort of where's the smart money going? What areas are hot? I mean, you touched on ABM, agent-based modeling, in your introduction. Anything else? Where's the money going?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a number of layers because it often depends on the different types of demand. So we've seen some successful RegTech developments and investments in the wealth management space, because the wealth management space really was demand driven by the client side to have more digital engagement, to have more automation, and also to make sure, of course, that compliance is assured at all times in terms of what can you sell to whom, particularly when you look at the high net worth space. So we've seen positive developments, including corporate-led, so for example, corporate venture-led, such as bank venture in that space, and implementation. So that is a space that continues to grow. When we think about the sort of regulatory demand side, particularly in the investment banking space, for many years we've seen a lot of demand around trading and making sure that compliance in trading is assured, using, for example, behavioral analytics, data analytics to make sure that that space stays clean. The ABN example is quite interesting in terms of the economic driver. So even though implementation is at many levels still slow because of the sort of the data science lag in some of the institutions, as soon as you start positioning agent-based risk modeling from an economic perspective, for example, how can an investment bank improve their trading algorithm to be better than others at an exchange, you start to see the appetite. So whilst in my view, that risk management tool has so many broad applications that you can actually truly apply in the broader Basel context, in the broader sort of black swan event context, we do see adoption and interest both in investing and adopting primarily from that economic driver side. I think another area where investment starts to grow is an area where applications do not need to be embedded deep into the infrastructure of an institution. We all know that the larger big banks, including also the smaller ones, have legacy infrastructure problems, which is one of the barriers we'll probably come to in a minute. But as soon as you have a solution that doesn't need to plug in too deep into the infrastructure and can still deliver real benefit, that's where the investment sees the viability of adoption. So to call it just an example is, for example, automating signature lists using blockchains or other type of solutions where signature lists, I mean, it's echoing a little bit Shruti's comments on the Lehman case and digging through all the paper. An equal sort of real challenge is constantly updating signature lists for large institutions. And if we can automate those, you really deliver immediate economic value, immediate compliance value, and you don't need to plug deep into the infrastructure. And that is an area that I find quite interesting from an investment perspective. Just to echo Anastasia's point, ESG is indeed becoming much more relevant. And this is about how do we thoughtfully actually review existing RegTech developments and future ones with that lens, and how we position this and how we can realize economic benefit, shareholder benefit, but also ultimately ESG benefit, because we're actually becoming more efficient and more thoughtful across all these three parameters.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. And let's just pick up on the point you mentioned about barriers. I think this is a great segue to talk about the barriers to RegTech adoption and what those challenges are. And I think because each of you cover different parts of the RegTech ecosystem, I'm going to ask this question to all of you. What are the challenges that are out there that create a barrier for the RegTech industry to grow and for firms to adopt RegTech? And then, I guess, having discussed the barriers, what do you think, how do you think these can be addressed? What would you like to see more of to address the challenges? And maybe I'll start with you, Anastasia. As the RegTech firm, what's the challenge when you speak to, potential clients? And how do you think it can be overcome? Let's go with you first. I think you are on mute. Yes.
I should be unmute now. Yes, quite a few, but to give an opportunity for everyone, I'm just gonna keep it very brief. For me, one of the key challenges is that as growing, we are a startup, scale up, perhaps stage at this time. But as going through this experience, being a small company, delivering, as Shruti pointed out correctly, we focus on one problem, and we try to fix that problem. But the problem generally is much bigger. So as each and every one of us starts to address one piece of that bigger problem, what is that connectivity? How do I work with other systems, be it already inside the bank and also external solutions, and bring it all together to address a more meaningful part of the problem that organizations is trying to solve? That has always been a big challenge for us. That we try to address through integrations, of course, and exposing public API, and also collaborating just generally in the industry. Mm-hmm. And another one I would talk about as a data science shop with AI capabilities, we constantly are presented with conversations around what does your AI do and the black box feel of it. How do we make people confident in the technologies that we use and transparent to the point that they can actually feel confident of the results that it produces?
And then just the second part to that, so given those are the challenges you see, any ideas on, how can these be overcome, or how can these be addressed? I mean, appreciate some of them, they will take time, they will take years, but what's your perspective?
I find it really great and exciting that a lot of organizations that we work with recognize exactly that challenge of onboarding small but very innovative solutions, and the drive and the start of creating those innovation labs and within the organizations, and driving the adoption of innovation with a budget attached to it, and people with subject matter expertise and knowledge of the way the business works is incredibly valuable to organizations such as ours. So I think that that's the biggest way that's the biggest impact I see right now. That's making it for the RegTech community.
Yep. Thank you, Anastasia. And Nicola, over to you. I know you guys have done, DBA has done the consultation survey on RegTech last year. And as part of that survey, that industry survey, what did you see? I mean, same question to you, as the barriers to adoption, and any ideas you have on potentially how these can be addressed?
Thanks, Sophia. So yeah, indeed, we conducted our survey and we hope to be publishing the report in a couple of months. I will leave to the other panelists to cover the kind of issues that they've seen from their industry perspective. And maybe I can just take that sort of more self-reflective look about what regulators and supervisors are seeing about the challenges that we are facing ourselves in terms of impeding or potentially hindering the facilitation of this innovation. So, I mean, firstly, I think we've mentioned it and it's across the board, but from a regulatory standpoint, the lack of skills, the knowledge and understanding of RegTech is the understanding of the technologies, the innovations. How can we facilitate institutions adopting RegTech if we don't have that understanding to share that with the institutions themselves? And that's also a trust issue. I think there are regulatory issues, and we've mentioned a few times about the degree of regulations that are out there. There's also the speed of change, which these RegTech solutions are trying to address, but then if the speed of change of these regulations is happening so quickly, it makes them difficult to be adopted and then to maintain their kind of compliance with those regulations. And then overall a sort of inconsistent supervisory approaches. So the supervisors themselves across the member states, can you hear me okay? Yeah, we're talking about the single market in the EU. There could be inconsistent supervisory practices with implementing those regulations, which then makes it harder for the RegTech provider and the institution themselves to adopt those solutions. And there's also a lack of harmonized standards. So even if it's not regulatory based, what about having standards in place to make sure that supervisors have the same approaches? And so moving on to sort of what we can do, I think in the short term, there are some roles for the regulator and the supervisors to play. I mean, for the EBA, we have a mandate and to kind of promote and monitor the scaling up of innovation. So on a large scale across the EU, like thinking about how we can help this kind of facilitation, we can use things like the innovation facilitators. I think you mentioned earlier about sandboxes, innovation hubs. That's that safe testing environment to bring these RegTech providers into that kind of environment to better understand the regulatory environment and to be able to test that and to get the feedback from the regulators and supervisors. We can definitely work on that skills and knowledge gap that we've mentioned a few times to build that up and to make sure that there's a common understanding, to raise awareness as well. And then we can bring together the three key stakeholders, so the institutions, the RegTech providers and the regulators and supervisors, to have this dialogue or trialogue to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Let's deal with those issues quickly and promptly and identify what we can do to work together better. So those are kind of solutions in the short term, I'd say, from a regulatory perspective.
Thank you, Nicola. And then Shruti, over to you. Your perspectives, barriers, and any ideas on how they can be addressed so the industry can grow.
And I'm going to be really practical. I feel like Anastasia and Nicola have given a really helpful sort of macro vision, and my life, I suppose, on the ground is so much more practical, which is just, why do people not use RegTech? It's because when the RegTech provider comes in, they're not able properly to sort of demonstrate the return on investment. And I think actually the biggest reason why RegTech isn't being adopted at the moment is that sort of that difficulty in measuring the value of a solution. Because I think, Anastasia, you might say, if you use clause match, you're going to avoid XYZ problems, which are ultimately going to lead to fines. But to demonstrate what is not happening, I think, is very, very difficult. I don't know, Anastasia, if you would concur with that in terms of just
absolutely agree with you. Absolutely agree with you.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you, because I know how many doors you knock on, is how often you wind up going to a financial institution, speaking to someone for 4 or 5 weeks, and then you realise that it's the wrong person. And so I think for me, practically, one of the barriers to RegTech or adoption is it's very, very rare that a financial institution will have a RegTech innovation tightly defined one point of contact. And in fact, the reason why we started Fuse was almost to create one front door into Allen & Overy, so that all legal tech companies know to come to one person. So we don't have one person here in, you know, this jurisdiction doing something in automation, someone in a different jurisdiction saying that they're an expert in legal tech doing something different. And it's funny because I've always thought of Fuse as being really good one front door, and then I had a phone call with one of my colleagues in the Frankfurt office today telling me they're doing 5 different pilots with 5 different providers, none of which I knew about. So, you know, even someone as well organised as us, Allen & Overy and Fuse, you know, it's really difficult, I think, to find the exactly right person to deal with. So for any RegTech companies who are listening to this, my practical suggestions are you need to be really tightly defined and really clear on what the value proposition is, and you need to deliver that in a way that I think is frightening to the buyer, so that kind of sort of delivers a realistic sense of what the downside is, but does show what the downside is if they do not plug the gap that you have identified for them, and also make sure you are speaking to the right person, because otherwise I think, you know, if you look at fintech and how quickly the growth of fintech has been, and you know, there's the opportunity is there. You know, people are like, oh, I see the opportunity. I think what's harder is where people are being asked to make an investment based on, you know, a potential damaging event they may or may not believe is going to happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Really well said. Ruth, do you have anything to add to that? I'm sure some points will have resonated with you.
It's very much psychology. I mean, sort of building on my previous comment, I mean, certainly the financial industry and banks are always seeking for profit, right? They're seeking for returns, something new for their clients, something they can make additional money with. No one really ever wants to think about the downside until it happened and we have to deal with it. And I think is that psychological play around positioning the whole sort of solution as an upside. So not only arguing that this will protect us from sort of certain fines and other issues, but more about how can we create further value to make it more client-centric, make the client happy, make the ecosystem happy, etc. So it's about that positioning and trying to show some sort of return on investment, you know, that sort of probably ultimately will happen. It's how you present the case. I think I completely agree with Shruti's comments around finding the right person in the bank. I mean, not only the actual sales cycle can take years in a big financial institution, that sales cycle hasn't even started before you found the right team. And finding the right team, I've seen that a number of RegTechs that have been very successful were actually those that had worked in those banks before, that knew the right teams and that could start to sell exactly into that team, because it's all about finding your internal stakeholder, your internal sort of literally business promoter, because the person you're selling to within a bank is the person that actually sells it internally. And getting that engagement is the most difficult thing. So it's never really about the tech. It's never even about what you can achieve. It's about how you're getting in. And then the other things, of course, have to fall into place. So it certainly requires a culture shift on the bank side, but we know that this will take many, many decades. So it's always good to be very thoughtful around the right network inside and making sure that you can present an upside as opposed to just downside protection.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I mean, if I can add some perspective here, I think what I would like to see also more from RegTech firms is them really sort of challenging the banks if they're speaking to our banks, and really asking some questions where we as a bank can see that, okay, they're really trying to figure out if they're speaking to the right person. Because I don't see enough of that, but I'd really like to see them sort of challenge banks more and say, right, let's try to work out if I'm even talking to the right guy that can help me, or lady that can help me internally. But yeah, super interesting. Let's pick up on what we talked about earlier on the sandboxes, because on the regulatory sandboxes, because potentially that could be an initiative that can help the RegTech go, and that can also give firms the comfort that, oh, the solution's been through a regulatory sandbox. Maybe we should really take a close look at it. And I'd like to come to you, Anastasia, because what we've seen over the last, I don't know, is it 5 years, is regulators at the national level initially set up these regulatory sandboxes, and the regulator in the UK the FCA, was the first regulator to set this up. And then more recently, we saw regulators around the world come together under the GFIN, the Global Financial Innovation Network, to create a global regulatory sandbox. And I understand that CloseMatch was one of the first firms to test the RegTech proposition in a regulatory sandbox. So could you tell us a little bit about what exactly did you guys test? And what did you get out of it? And how do you think these sandboxes can potentially help address some of the challenges we just discussed?
Yeah, so we have been fortunate to participate in a number of sandboxes and still do to this day, and this has been a journey and quite an experience for us. But bottom line, realistically, based on what CloseMatch is, document management, policy management, regulatory change management, that's what we were testing. We were trying to, and what we want to get to is machine-readable digital rulebooks applied into machine-readable digital policy management at the firm. So how do we bring the regulations in a format and in a form that allows us to map it to policies and procedures, and to very quickly identify what an impact of a regulation would be, and also go through a change management process internally if the regulations change. So for us, some of those initiatives were around working with horizon scanning and content providers in the RegTech space, collaborating on a joint end-to-end proposition for the regulated firms, and also working with the regulated firms to see how we can enhance those processes internally as well, and what that change management, implementation, project management should look like in the organization. So that's ultimately the goal, impact of the regulation and streamlining the implementation of that regulation in the business. Being part of those programs obviously gave us a safe environment to test our ideas, because they are ideas and there are different ways of approaching a problem and trying to test which idea works better. And we did I personally like the start and the end to a program. So it's a way to quickly validate something in a much more controlled, focused way, and then kind of validate if it succeeds or fails. Fails are good too. We always talk about fail fast. That's what we need to happen for the RegTech to survive as a company. Another one is being small, sometimes lack of or limited access to subject matter experts in the space we operate. That's what sandboxes give us, a co-creative space and a space to collaborate with various stakeholders across the ecosystem, and that allows to tap into some of that knowledge that you wouldn't be able to get to in any other way. And I guess the third one is, and it is pretty obvious, is that's a way also to tell the world what we as a company do and what our product is capable of. So it is a way to generate potentially new business, right? So creating those networking and exposure to potential buyers of our solution, and people just generally knowing what we do is really, really important. But just to kind of wrap up on how those initiatives can help in general for Sandbox and how those initiatives help RegTech, it's bringing everybody together as an ecosystem. That's a huge benefit of those programs, and a quicker time to market, getting products out quicker or stopping them if we know that they're not going anywhere quicker.
Thank you, Anastasia. And Nicola, I'd like to come to you again. And really, the question here is, what can we expect from the EBA on RegTech? What should we look out for?
Sorry, thanks, Sophia. So, I mean, as you said, we've published we will be publishing our report and the RegTech market landscape at the moment. So it will be published in the next couple of months. And what we did was conduct a survey mid last year, and also a follow-up survey with our financial institutions and RegTech providers end of last year and beginning of this year. It's really a kind of point in time on the EU regulatory landscape. It's going to kind of look at what those COVID developments have been, the status of adoption, the issues within institutions in terms of their governance processes. So we're looking at it as a kind of point in time report of the current market landscape. And we're also looking at 5 key focus areas on RegTech, and that's AML, fraud, reporting, ICT security and creditworthiness assessment, with AML being the sort of #1 area as a result of, I think, COVID as well. And as Shruti said, it's low-hanging fruit. So things like EID, remote onboarding, it's really kind of picked up in the last year. We will then also be making proposals about how to support the facilitation of this innovation for RegTech and using some of the tools that I mentioned earlier. But essentially, we want to raise awareness in the regulatory and supervisory community. We want to open up the discussion for how to take the next step to support digital transformation. And it's very much in line with the sort of wider policy debate from the European Commission in their digital finance strategy, which mentioned RegTech as a focus area for the next 4 years. So I definitely see that from our perspective and both from the Commission perspective, it's really an area where we'll be looking at. And it's also the Commission, you will have seen in its digital finance strategy, picked up on things like data and having the right data for the RegTechs to be able to move forward as well. So I think that there's another sort of opening there to discuss the data that's needed for RegTech as well.
Thank you, Nicola. We will be watching the space very closely, and just sort of slowly coming to an end here on the panel. I'll ask 2 more questions. First one for you, Ruth. Your observations in terms of the impact that you think COVID-19 has had, specifically on RegTech. I mean, it's impacted every single industry. Your views.
I mean, first of all, I mean, everybody sort of is very aware about the impact of digitization, which with it brings the risk of further cyber attack risks, operational resilience risks, and really dealing just with your staff working from home and all those problems. And I know that that's been discussed many, many times already. If we look at the RegTech space, it really depends on how mature a company already was. What I've seen from a venture capital perspective over the last year and a half is that there have been quite a number of firms that really struggled with closing their funding rounds, with remaining viable, because RegTech is one of those areas that was probably sort of deprioritized by many financial institutions as one of the first areas, just because it's still in its infancy. It almost always looks like a nice to have, but not business critical, even though it's actually the other way around. And so there have been sort of a few fallouts. And of course, there have been luckily many government support activities, if we just look at the UK with the Future Fund and other measures. So I think that sort of digitization risk, cyber risk has increased, while some of the RegTechs really had challenges. Even though they had good products, they were even stuck further in that sales cycle, in finding the right sort of business contact within a bank, or even finding the attention. I mean, I've got one interesting example which relates to our previous bank, where there's been an incredibly good conversation early last year, and then nothing was ever heard again because it was not a priority. And I think it has to become really a priority at C-suite level to see how RegTech can enable the firm to become more viable, to continue to be viable even as a big bank, because it's about those operational risks and those efficiency points. So I think that's certainly one area. I mean, as I said, cyber risk is clearly on the exponential growth side, and therefore things like risk modeling will also become more relevant. And I would love to see sort of the whole banking landscape start to really look at their deeper infrastructure, move to cloud, move to different sort of approaches around security and authentication and biometrics, just to make sure that the whole thing gets a lot safer. But yeah, it has been a challenging year and a half, and I hope we are now back at a level where these projects continue to flourish more.
Thank you, Ruth. And then the final question, just to wrap up, let's look into the future. And I would like to ask each of you, what are your predictions for the future of RegTech? What's going to happen next? We talked a little bit about ESG in some of the areas. Maybe Nicola, let's start with you, and then we do Anastasia, Shruti, and we end with Ruth. Nicola, your predictions.
Thank you. So I'm going to take it from a kind of broader EU economic perspective. And I think that digital finance has an important role to play in the kind of economic recovery and economic transformation. And I think that links closely to the ESG point that Anastasia mentioned earlier. And I think, where does RegTech sit in this? Definitely more uptake of RegTech solutions. I think better interoperability, which was mentioned as well, better cooperation between the kind of key stakeholders. So hopefully they're playing their part in the kind of digital transformation of the EU finance sector.
Thank you, Nicola. Anastasia, your predictions. What's coming next?
Yeah, I would echo. And as a technologist, what my prediction is, I envision the world where technologists and subject matter experts with legal and compliance will unite and get together and be able to not go through 3 days of training to get a low-code or no-code solution to work, but actually have a no-code, low-code solution completely off the shelf, ready to go for them. And it's going to be an ecosystem across multiple technologies, all being brought together for the greater united utility model, I guess. So technology will understand humans better. Absolutely.
Thank you, Anastasia. And Shruti, your predictions for the future of RegTech.
I feel like such a complete cheat, piggybacking off both Nicola and Anastasia, but just to kind of make the point, which is obvious, I think, which is RegTech is only going to be effective if people are working within multidisciplinary teams, and if they really understand the importance of cognitive diversity and of having every sort of correct bit of the ecosystem plugged in. So Anastasia, I was pleased to hear you mention lawyers. Lawyers are so often forgotten in the equation, but we're such an important part of the ecosystem. And I think when we get people working together better and understanding each other better, I think we will start to see RegTech really start to take off.
And to close, Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, what I see, and I'm sure everybody can echo that, is that these sort of emerging new players on the financial services scene are those that are actually adopting RegTech as part of their setup. So if I think about the neobanks, it's a no-brainer for them to have automated processes, screening, and everything else. And I think as that continues, and as some of the bigger players may still continue to lag behind, we might see some interesting competition in certain areas of financial services, certainly more in the retail space for now, where those that are taking a strategic view to adoption of RegTech from the outset and that sort of agile refreshing over time are going to be at a competitive advantage. And I think that is certainly in the interest of the competition authorities to make sure that there's a better, more sort of active market. On the higher end of the bank side, I would wish to see, as we've mentioned already on the panel, a much more streamlined process for any fintech or RegTech or insurtech or whatever to access a firm and to have a real team that looks after them and that helps to position the solution and also helps with the internal business case development. We do see some of the global banks doing a quite good job at that, and we see others doing not such a good job. And again, I see this as a competitive advantage. So for those that are going to be late to the party, they will eventually pay the price.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Anastasia. This was extremely comprehensive. So now we will move on to, I think, audience Q&A, which Panagiotis, you will moderate before we close.
I'll tell you this, because due to the fact we're facing some technical glitch, you can carry on for the next with a round of one question or so.
Sure. If there's a question the audience would like to ask, shoot.
Till now, unfortunately, I can't shoot because I don't have any ammunition on the audience part. Therefore, I'll try to be more peaceful. I was wondering, at first, ladies, I must admit that I'm more than grateful about your presence here today, and as well for the great and fruitful discussion that we were fortunate enough to follow during the last 60 minutes. And we appreciate it big time, and many thanks to each one of you. I was wondering, you touched each aspect, let's say, of RegTech. All these, are there big time in theory, or do we follow it also on reality in business wise, let's say? Because many times it's a matter of something that may be rhetoric, or we say something, but it's quite difficult to try to let's say to empower it and to take it to to try to execute it in on a daily basis. What's your experience on this?
Good question. I don't know who would like to take this. How does it happen in practice, I guess, is your question.
Exactly.
Maybe just
I can start just to save Anastasia the embarrassment of saying it works really well in practice. But I would say the key to success of making something work well in practice is threefold, really. One is understanding the solution properly before you buy it, so you understand that the fit is actually there and that it's going to do the things that you want. Second, I think, though, is expectation management. I think also all too often, at least in my law firm, I'll have a solution, it will do 80% of the job, but it's a startup, so it's not perfect. And instead of everyone saying, oh my gosh, it does 80% of the job, I get 400 emails telling me the 20% that it doesn't do. And I think the thing that, the person who is the sponsor of any kind of new initiative needs to set the expectations of the individuals within the firm to explain it is going to do X, it is not yet going to do Y. And we know it would be great if it did Y, but this company has been around for 3 minutes and it has raised like 20p in seed funding, and so therefore this is not happening immediately. But this 80% is so much better than nothing, so let's work with what we've got and let's try and kind of work around the things that don't exist. So a perfect example, I talked earlier about being business ready, and actually I talked about 24-hour lines and helplines. Almost none of the fuse cable companies that we have that, because that actually requires quite a lot of infrastructure and resource, and it's quite a big thing to have. And so what we will do is we will take a part of our IT team, train them up and get them to a point where they can actually answer X% of questions and do some troubleshooting, so that we do have some form of 24-hour resource, and we'll take those bits off the company's hands, because our understanding is that we will do better with it, with the product, than without. So the key to success, I think, is the product fit needs to be correct, the expectations need to be correct, but thirdly, I think for us, once you buy a solution, that's kind of really only half of the problem. The third thing is the cultural change around using it, because so many times you'll get a solution and no one really wants to change the way they did it. So you'll have it, you'll pay for it, and it will get completely ignored. And so the third thing, I think, to make something a success really is the cultural change involved in getting people to try new things and do things differently and make their business as usual the new way of doing things, the new way of working.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, it is clear that for smaller firms, it's much easier to embrace RegTech and automation. Generally, I'm working at the moment with an FX broker that has been working well for 20 years, but they didn't scale because everything was manual. And I'm coming in and saying, guys, we can use this for onboarding, this for identification, this for authentication, this for the process optimization internally to make sure everything's compliant. And then there's a residual of a few manual interventions just in terms of escalation to manage. All of that is integrated by an integration company, and there it is. And it can be done. And I think that's the beauty of doing it hands-on, as we keep on talking about lots of RegTech. It is possible to do. And maybe just to echo on Shruti's comments, of course, it also is always a question around the size and stability of the RegTech firm. The very large corporations may not want to work with a very early startup. It takes some time to kind of grow and get some critical mass, because you need to manage the vendor risk. But if you're in a smaller company and you've got somebody who can deliver, and you can start to see how this can scale up, and there is a path for the company itself to grow and be strategic around that, it is a match made in heaven. And so I think we can actually build a number of really interesting companies that can ultimately compete better with the bigger players that may take longer to adopt.
Okay, thank you very much again. Hope take care and be safe, and hope to see you later on another event, probably, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time and your expert insights. That was excellent.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.